Now, Qatar has established itself on the world stage with this World Cup. Boy oh boy, does this continue to be an uphill battle against arguably the loudest Western media and civil societal campaign against any sporting event in history. Many go as far as calling for a boycott. So I've been asking myself, why? Short disclaimer to those who cannot accept that someone who looks like me might defend a Middle Eastern country. Yes, I've been living in the Middle East for more than 15 years, in and out. And yes, I used to work in Qatar between 2013 and 2017. And I've grown immensely fond of the country, the people, and its vision. And look, there is certainly a lot of valid criticism of Qatar. It's a developing country. The first issue remains with worker rights. While the kafala system has been abolished, enforcement of the new laws that have come in is very much inconsistent. Mostly because this remains a cultural learning curve. Like in other Gulf states, the kafala idea is still very much in the heads of most employers. And global labor migration is a huge challenge, and it provides a range of loopholes for exploitation. It begins with middlemen, recruitment firms, and it continues with the employers. And that's the case for migrant laborers in Europe, in the United States. Now, Qatar has taken much of the constructive criticism to heart and abolished the most severe practices of labor exploitation. There is now a freedom to change jobs. They introduced timely wage payment systems. There's a minimum wage. Occupational self-policies were introduced. There improved access to justice for workers, joint worker management commitments, and overall fairer recruitment chains. But again, the problem remains with inconsistent implementation and employers trying to find loopholes. But for the most in Northern Europe who are opposed to the World Cup in Qatar, this is not about human rights, but about the commercialization of global football and the corruption of FIFA, for which Qatar has somewhat, justly or unjustly, become the scapegoat. To say the least, there have been irregularities in FIFA governance for years, and allegations of corruption cannot be ignored. Qatar, like other bidding nations, played the system to its advantage, while Qatar still vehemently denies any allegations of corruption. This criticism of the Qatar bid has been cooking up in a Western, I would say mostly European echo chamber, often incited and ripened by PR companies, paid for by Qatar's neighbors. It has been driven by confirmation bias and the attempt to seek out any claim that could undermine Qatar's moral standing. Facts do not seem to matter as long as they serve the anti-Qatar narrative. And by the way, NGOs and human rights organizations appear to be far more balanced than the media. And many of the human rights experts have now kind of made a living being cited and quoted criticizing the World Cup. It's almost like a cottage industry. The coverage of the media has been overwhelmingly negative. Recent findings show that 66% of all British press articles on Qatar were critical or negative, driven by moral outrage, motivated by the desire to show yourself as moral and maintain a sense of moral identity. And any story about Qatar has been somewhat linked to the World Cup. You know, a British man who left the country, didn't pay his debts, complained being prosecuted in absentia in Doha, something that would have never made national news before the World Cup. Societal pressures in the UK, Germany and Scandinavia have become so overwhelming that everyone seems to feel somewhat coerced to fall in line and take a side in what has been framed as an existential cultural war. Footballers and commentators are shamed into taking a stance like they've never had to do before. Thereby, much of the sensationalist coverage of the World Cup is deliberately driven by misinformation and disinformation. I mean, let's look at the number of the 6,500 worker deaths that The Guardian has come up with, or the more outlandish figure of 15,000 workers' deaths that I saw in the German media. Both figures refer merely to non-Qataris of various nationalities and in various occupations who've died in Qatar in the past decade. While the 6,500 figure includes only blue-collar workers, the 15,000 figure includes any non-Qatari who died from either a traffic accident or heart attack over the past 10 years. And it includes white-collar bankers, doctors, shops assistants, and taxi drivers. And by the same token, a country like Germany had 10 million deaths in the past decade, building, for example, the BER Berlin airport. We would never make that connection, obviously. And don't forget, 90% of people living in Qatar are non-Qatari, and the vast majority of them do not work in construction, let alone construction related to the World Cup. But I think more problematic for people in the region, because this campaign has not just experienced pushback from the Qataris, but from Arabs across the region, for them the problem is the use of Orientalist and often Islamophobe narratives. Some journalists told me that our Western values were better than theirs. The moral lecture that we've seen from football pundits on the BBC that filled in for the non-shown opening ceremony is a case in point. Those people never voiced any criticism about Russia 2018 or China 2022. There is a moral superiority complex at play here that misrepresents the consensus on values in the wider region and beyond. And we shouldn't forget that there is a consensus that is based on socio-cultural norms in the region when it comes to LGBTQ and women's rights. And this is a societal consensus that is not imposed from above. And then we have seen all kinds of moral equivalents being drawn. Most outlandish, the one between Qatar and Nazi Germany and their use of Olympic Games for propaganda in 1936. We've had a range of Orientalist images and frames being used of Qatar as the all-rich state of sheikhs, reduced to sand dunes and camels. One Guardian article opened with the line, "Qatar is a rich Gulf nation known for both its huge oil reserves and its flagrant human rights abuses." Now, the rich sheikhdom is believed to be able to pay for everything. That's kind of what everyone thinks. Nobody questioned the narrative of paid fans when they saw supporters from South Asia dancing in the street, because it fits the preconception of Qatar. It pays for everything. And it broke with the European expectation that England and Germany fans had to be blonde and blue-eyed. Yes, some influencers were flown in on all paid-for packages, but they were hardly going to fill in the corniche. Some went as far as believing the fake news that Qatar had actually paid the Ecuadorian team to win and get a victory. It sounded plausible to those who wanted to believe it. Then there are all these frames of Qatar as a medieval Sharia-based state. One interviewer in London said,
"How much respect should we show to cultures which we consider to be, frankly, an abomination?"
Abomination. And then you have this French correspondent who summed up his first impression of Qatar as,
"Bon, vous êtes bien installés, tout va bien, il n'y a pas de souci, la ville est belle.
Il y a beaucoup de mosquées.
Oui.
Then you had fear-based headlines of Qatar that is going to flog fans for misconduct. And that was very much widespread. Last but not least, there has been this undertone of this region has no football culture. If you look at what former German player Lahm said, he said football isn't a popular sport in Qatar. I think the Saudi victory over Argentina certainly proved him wrong. And then he went on to say FIFA has damaged soccer and its credibility as a Western organization. Well, the last time I checked, FIFA stood for Fédération Internationale de Football Association. International. And then there is the hypocrisy that comes with all of this discussion that makes it so very difficult to engage with this debate. The hypocrisy is something important to highlight because it makes you wonder why Qatar, why not China, why not Russia? And there is this beautiful killer argument of saying, oh, this is all whataboutism. But whataboutism should not be a shield behind which hypocrites can actually hide. I mean, where was everyone before the 2008 and 2022 China Olympics? Where was everyone during the 2018 Russian World Cup? You know, when you had a prominent Qatar critic from The Guardian arguing how absurd to boycott a World Cup when Russia is so bound up in our economy. And when vocal BBC pundits, who are now very critical of Qatar, have no problem being photographed next to Putin. And where is everyone when they holiday in Dubai or they attend the Abu Dhabi or Bahrain GP, where LGBTQ rights are just the same as in Qatar and where I would say labor exploitation is far worse? Also, if Qatar was such a bad country, how come that it is okay for the German government to beg Qatar for an energy bailout? I think you should be consistent then and boycott Qatar's gas. Same goes for the UK. The thing is that much of what we see here is virtue signaling. You know, publicly expressing opinions or sentiments intended to demonstrate one's own good character and moral standing. And nothing screams virtue signaling more than Hummel, Denmark's sports outfitter, issuing a protest jersey made in some Asian sweatshop to protest against nothing else than worker exploitation. Kind of absurd. It might make it easier and less costly to come and be critical of Qatar. It's much easier than doing that for Russia or China. Qatar is a small state, it's less visible, it appears to be less powerful, it has actually taken criticism on board constructively rather than pushing back, at least in the beginning. It has made changes, right? It tried to accommodate Western voices. Now, this rant is not supposed to take away from those genuine voices who've been consistent, who've been fair, who've been constructive over the last 12 years in their criticism of Qatar and other sporting events, and who've drawn on extensive on-the-ground knowledge of the country and have really made a difference for workers on the ground. Most of them have actually steered far away from getting sucked into a boycott campaign and have said engagement is better than boycott.